Get started. My name is Jennifer Bland. I'm going to be talking about how to hire good programmers. I'd like to see a show of hands. How many in the room are actually developers or designers? How many of you have gone through a technical interview to get that position that you were in? Okay. I'm pretty sure that we go through the process that you've gone through for your interview is going to be pretty much consistent with everybody in the room. And I'm going to put together an argument that we shouldn't be doing that, and I'm going to show you hopefully what I think is a better way in order to interview people to find good quality programmers for your team. To give you some information about myself, I'll have this up as the last slide also, but here is how you can get in touch with me. Contact me if you need to reach out to me. My website is appropriately named jenniferbland.com. My Twitter account, my GitHub account are all Rat Race Grad. Ignore the last one where it says Jennifer Bland. It's been changed to Rat Race Grad. And then I also have a YouTube channel. And I'll talk about that YouTube channel at the very end because I've got some information that might be beneficial to you if you are looking to get a new job as a developer or to find your next job as a developer. So, at the start of all of my presentations that I've ever done, I start off by doing the simple game, 3 truths and 1 lie. And I do this for 2 reasons. 1, is people enjoy it. 2, it allows me to overcome my jitters because I get to talk about myself at the beginning of my presentation so that when I actually start talking, I've overcome all of my fear of speaking. So I'm going to give you 4 facts. 3 of these about myself are true. 1 is not. At the end of my presentation, I'll give you the list again and let you guess which one of these 4 is not true. And of the 4, the first one is I made only 1 D at university. I graduated from Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. And the rest of what I made in my college career were all A's. I was in the 2nd largest California earthquake. I've been to England 24 times. And the last one is I have more toy soldiers than Winston Churchill. And what I'm talking about are the little lead cast Britain's toy soldiers that are out there. So think about that, and at the end of my presentation, I'll let you know which one of those is not true. So my talk is about how to hire good developers. And my suggestion is that we actually change the process that we use in interviewing developers. And the reason why is I think the process that we go through today, it actually sucks. So let me see a show of hands. When you did your interview for your developer position or as a designer, you actually had to do a coding challenge. Okay? How many of you actually had to do a whiteboard exercise? It's a pretty common thing that we have. How many of you did phone screens? Now, how many of you did all 3 of those as part of your interview process? Okay, my suggestion is that we look at doing a different method that we go through in order to interview people. And my suggestion is that we actually do 3 things. And those 3 things is we stop doing at-home coding challenges. And then the next one is that we replace that by doing very short coding challenges. And when I say short, I mean something where you ask somebody a question and they can write the answer in 10 lines of code or less. And it allows them to go through it. And then the last thing that we do is that we have a casual series of questions on topics. And I'm going to go through each one of those 3 steps and explain why I propose that. So the very first one is stop doing at-home coding challenges. And the main reason that I ask for that is this is an actual coding challenge I was given for a job. You look at it on a set date and time, they email me the coding challenge and say, here it is, you've got 90 minutes, go complete as much of this or all of this as you can do in 90 minutes. Now, when you start looking at this, it's pretty detailed about what they want. I mean, it's a page length of stuff that they want me to do. The thing that this is going to stumble with a lot of programmers, especially if you're good programmers, How many of you work on legacy code, meaning you work on improvements or enhancements to existing code base? How many of you, if you go to work on Monday, is going to start a new project from scratch where no code has ever been written? It's like one person. Do y'all work together? It's something that you don't do on a regular basis. In order for you to complete this challenge, you're actually going to have to stand up a whole framework, get it going, get it configured. I mean, how many of you have ever done that? I mean, how many of you like set up Angular, you got to have Node installed, you got to have Express installed, you got to have Angular installed, you got to either install Bootstrap, Angular, Material, you've got to have all the packages that you're going to use with Express, anything else that you're going to need, and get it working before you can write your first line of code, which is what they want to test you on, is your code. In order to do this in 90 minutes, you might, it's something that you don't do on a regular basis, is spinning this up, standing up a new project from scratch. So even though you may be the best programmer in the world, since this is something that you don't do on a daily basis, it may take you 20 minutes, 30 minutes out of that 90 just to get ready to start writing your code. And then you're going to be rushing yourself. So now you're panicking. You're rushing yourself to try to get it done in the next 90 minutes. And that's what they're going to judge you about, is the code that you can write in the time that's left over for doing something that you don't do on a regular basis. And so that's why I suggest that you stop doing in-home coding challenges, because you're getting programmers that are doing stuff that they're not doing on a regular basis. Here's another one that I got. This is where you're given 1 hour to go through and do something like this. This doesn't require like the first example where it requires you to basically stand up an entire framework in order to get going. This is something you can actually just start writing out of the box using either straight JavaScript, Java, Ruby if you want, because you can specify using any language of choice, where you're not having to put in the framework and you just get it going. But if you're going to write tests as part of your code, you do have to include whatever test library that you're going to be using to work with your code. So it's a little bit more of a thing, but it's more of a coding challenge where you actually see how well somebody does. This is the last example that I'm going to show you. This one's a little bit different, is that they're asking you to create an entire front-end, back-end stack in order to create a game. You're going to have to style it, so you have to have a lot of CSS knowledge, design work on the front end. You've got to be able to store the information on the back end because you're playing with other players. So you need something where players are going to be able to log in, so you have to have access to the account, so you have to set up authentication. You've got to have persistence of data, so you've got to set up a database. You've got to style it on the front end. In order just to get basics going, it's going to take a developer a little while in order to do all of this. And then they basically are going to judge you based on how much are you going to figure out. At a bare minimum, they expect you to complete level 1. If you're going to be above level, then you want to at least get level 2 in. And then level 3 is that you now need to deploy your application to a server, which is maybe something that you don't do on a regular basis either as a developer. But you're being judged on that, on everything that you've done. So when you look at people that write this code, if it took you a long time to get it set up and you've had less time to actually write code, then that's going to impact how well they're going to judge you as a developer. And I don't think that that's a good reflection of you as a developer or the quality of code that you can write, is how long it's going to take you to stand up a server that you don't even do on a regular basis. So what I recommend doing is that instead of doing very long take-home coding challenges like that, you replace that by doing very short coding exercises. And what you want to do is, what I suggest is, you take those short coding exercises and you break them down into four areas. And the reason I say 4 is that most of the time when you're interviewing a programmer, you're going to be interviewing them for an hour or maybe 90 minutes. And I'm assuming that you're going to be talking to them for an hour and a half as you go through this process. If you break it into 4 areas, then that gives you 15 minutes to spend on each one of those 4 areas. If you think about the tech stack that you use today in your job, there are probably 4 areas that you're clearly doing work on. Even if you're a front-end developer, or you're just a back-end developer, or you do full stack. You might need to know about HTML, CSS, you might need to know about JavaScript, you might need to know about jQuery, you might need to know about back-end stuff like Node, or some other areas. So very quickly there, just by listing things off, I came up with 4 possible areas that you can use to break that down into 15-minute chunks of information. So what you want to do is, for example, if the very first section that you have is HTML, CSS, you're going to spend 15 minutes on that topic, and the main goal is to determine the level of knowledge that that person has on that one particular topic. So I'm going to walk through and I'm going to show you a series of questions that you can ask in that 15-minute chunk on, let's say, HTML and CSS. So the first question that you might ask really isn't a coding challenge. It's just going to be, here's a question, tell me your answer. And the question might be, what's the difference between an ID and a class? How many have ever been asked this question in a coding interview? It's a pretty common question, especially if you're a front-end developer. It might be a very common question they might ask. And if you answer that question, you get a choice as a developer to say as little or as much as you want in answering that question. Most people, at the very bare minimum, will go through and say, oh, well, an ID has to be unique, a class doesn't have to be unique, you know, you can only have one ID per page, a class you can have multiple classes, and that's the main difference between them. Okay, valid answer to the question. Does it show you how well they know CSS? Maybe not. Another person might go on and take that answer and then start giving you more information and say, well, you can have more than one class assigned to an element. You can only have one ID assigned to an element. You can have IDs and classes assigned to the same element, so it can have both. So now you've given more detail about that. Then they might go in and start talking about specificity. You know, an ID has a higher level of specificity than a class. So therefore, if an ID says that the color is going to be red, but the class says the color is going to be blue, the ID is going to win out because it has a higher value. Another thing that you might go on and talk about is if you have 2 classes that are assigned to an element, one says the color is red, the other one that says that the color is blue, which one wins out? Well, it depends on which one comes last in your style sheet. That's the one that gets applied, and that's the one that wins out. So you keep getting more detail and more information. Another thing that you can maybe tell about IDs, IDs are specified in CSS with a pound sign. A class is specified with a period when you're defining it in your style sheet. That pound sign for the ID is important because if you have a URL where you're going to, you know, mydomain.com #contact, a browser will basically by default, because there's that pound sign, look for an ID on the page called contact and will automatically scroll the page to where that ID is to show you the content on the page. All of those are valid answers about what's the difference between an ID and a class. And you can go through and you can see how much information that they provide to you and in details. And I can explain why that's important, because after we start talking about all the questions that you might be asked on HTML and CSS, I will show you, you know, why that all that information is important because you're actually going to be evaluating these candidates and you're going to be using a scoring system as part of that evaluation. So I wanted to go through and show you all the possible things that somebody can answer in regards to the very simple questions such as this. Next question, what does the box model refer to in CSS? You might talk about what it includes, like it includes the content, it includes padding, it includes the border. It doesn't really include the margins, but the margins are important because it sets up the alignment to other items that are on the page. And, what is, the box model? Why is everything a box? What's involved? By asking very simple questions like this, they can tell you what they know about that. Now, when you go through and you're interviewing a programmer and you ask them these two questions, you probably have spent maybe 4 minutes with them just on 2 questions. So you're able to, in a 15-minute block of time, ask a whole series of questions. The next question might be, what's the difference between a reset file and a normalize, in CSS? What's the difference between them? What do they provide? What's the difference between them? Why would you use one over the other one? And let them answer the question in as much detail as they can possibly answer. And as you can see, as you're looking at these questions as they go along, they start off from something that's very basic to where they get to be a little bit more challenging as they go along. The next one might be, what's the difference between inline block, and block? All 3 are different, all 3 have different characteristics, all have limitations on them, and you want to see how much information they can provide you in answering very simple questions like this. And so as you can see, in a short amount of time, we've gone through 4 different questions that are on there. Now we actually get to a point where we talk about actually writing code, which is kind of a hard thing to do because most people don't equate using HTML and CSS and writing code. You give them, here's some basic HTML, write me the CSS that will select the 2 inner list items that are on there, and it's the 2 list items that are 3A and 3B. So does anybody want to take a shot at what you would use for the CSS to actually get to those list items? Anybody want to take a chance? All right. Basically what you want to do is you start with the one thing that's defined on the page, and that's the class. So you have to start with the class, and from the class you have to chain to it that you're looking for, the list item, and then a UL inside of that, and then the list item itself. And that's how you would get access to that. So you might actually have them write this out. They can write this out on a piece of paper. They can write it out on a whiteboard if they want to. But it's basically really one line of code that you're putting in there for them to measure that. Now you're going to take that same question and make it a step harder. It would be, of those 2 list items, how do I get just the first one? Not both of them, but how do I get just the first one? And so that's a little bit more challenging in terms of the CSS that you're putting in. And you're making sure that they understand how to do that. It's easy to pick both of them, but the question is, how do I pick just the first one? And if they give you the CSS for that, you might ask them, well, what's the CSS if I wanted to get just the second one? So you can make it a little bit more challenging along that lines. Then the next one is, here's another HTML that you've gotten. Here is the CSS that you've gotten. If this HTML was rendered, what would the output look like? And ask them to describe it to you. And what you're testing them on is that they know the difference between div span and div greater than span. So they need to know what that difference is between those types of CSS selectors and what results that would have. And the results is that all work and no play and the text make Jack a dull boy would be red in color. but then the makes Jack a dull boy will also have a green background. And that's the difference between the two. You can actually take this question and do it in the reverse, where you say, here's my HTML, here's a picture of what the output looks like, give me the CSS that would create this output. I think that's a more challenging question to be asked. So what we've gone through is we've gone through a series of 8 questions, very simple 8 questions on HTML and CSS that you can ask in that 15-minute chunk. You can probably get 10 to maybe 12 questions that you can ask somebody on a topic in that 15 minutes. Now, when you've gone through that, at the end of 15 minutes, do you think that you would have a very good understanding of how well that candidate or that potential candidate knows about CSS by asking them very simple questions like that? Do you think that you would have a better understanding? Do you think you would have a better understanding of their HTML and CSS skills than you would if they created a drop-down box of a make and model, on a full stack, application that is using Angular and Node? Would you have a very good idea of how well they know CSS on that coding challenge that I showed you earlier? For example, would you have known how well they know CSS and HTML on the coding challenge where you asked them to create a jungle environment? You probably have no idea of their HTML and CSS skill in that coding challenge. But in 15 minutes, you've gone through and you've got a very good idea of their coding skills. Now, you've gone through and you've asked those questions in that 15-minute block, and then you would repeat that same process on 3 other tech areas that you have. You need to go through and do a scoring system. And what I recommend doing is that you actually end up with a sheet of paper that has all the questions that are going to be asked. You give it to every person in the room that's going to be interviewing the candidate. And what they do is they just go through and check off all the items that the candidate answers. So the very first thing that we walked through was, what's the difference between a class and an ID? So you have that spreadsheet, and they just check off the things that are on there. So let me show you what the actual spreadsheet looks like. So here is, for example, the very first question: what's the difference between a class and an ID? These are all the things that are different between them. And a candidate, you just check off every single one of those answers that they provide in the answer to that question. If they give you just the basic, an ID is unique, a class is not, you can only have one ID per element, you can have multiple classes, and that's all they give you, then you're probably going to check off 2 things that are on there, and that's it. That's all that they gave you. Now, when you come through and you actually do the scoring for the candidate, you might assign a point value to every single possibility that's on there. So I might give, an ID is unique, a class is not, excuse me, 1 point. Because at a bare minimum, everybody should be able to give that answer. But the information about using it in the URL to scroll, because you use that on an ID, I might give that 5 points, because that's something most people won't answer in an interview question. And you can look at it and you go through and you check everything off, and each candidate is going to get a score, and at the very end you're going to have a total that's been assigned to each candidate that comes in. And then you use that score to compare against other candidates that you've interviewed for that job. So when you're doing your score, you need to set up in your environment, what is your minimum score? If a candidate doesn't make your minimum score, you're like, thank you very much, we're going to move on with somebody else, and let them know. It also gives you a measure, between 2 different candidates. If you had John Doe and Jane Doe interviewing for the job, you have something that you compare them on. Most of the time when you ask somebody to do a coding challenge or you come in for an interview and you ask, let's say, we have 3 people in our department that usually will interview potential candidates. So you get feedback from 3 different people. And you'll say, after an hour-and-a-half interview, well, what'd you think about that candidate? Oh, well, they seem to, communicate well. They knew some of the answers, but not all of them. They struggled on, so-and-so topic. I mean, does that really give you an idea of how solid that candidate is? Because it's objective information that they're giving you on that particular candidate. By using a scoring system, you're setting the same standard on both candidates, and you're being able to compare them from there. And then if they happen to end up, if you have multiple candidates that end up with the exact same score, then you can use some other exercise or basically the gut feel of the people that interview with them to determine what you want to do as a resolution between 2 scores that are the same value. The next thing that you want to do, I suggest besides, the first suggestion is stop doing in-home coding challenges. Replace that by doing these short interviews. So you can spend an hour interviewing somebody, asking about 10 questions every 15 minutes on 4 different topics, and you're able to, as the questions progress from easy to hard, get a very good idea of how that candidate is doing. And then the third thing my suggestion is that you end up doing having what's called a casual conversation with that person. So, how many of you had lunch downstairs? Okay. How many of you sat at the table and talked to somebody that you didn't know but happened to be sitting at your table? Okay. After just having lunch with that person for 15, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, however long that you were sitting there talking to them, do you know their name? You know where they work. You know what they do for a living. You know where they came from. You know what tech stack that they might be using at their job and everything else like that. And you're just talking to them in the middle of eating your eggplant parmesan or your chicken, and you learn all of that information from them in a casual conversation. Why not use that exact same thing as part of your interview process to learn more about the programmer? And it's not to learn more about the programmer like, where did you go to school? Where do you work now? What are your favorite hobbies? It's not that type of casual conversation, but basically it is, here's a question, give me your answer to it, and it allows them to tell you, are they opinionated on the subject? Are they passionate about that subject? Do they hate that subject? Which is perfectly acceptable, that they may not like it, and that's fine. But you can learn about them in an environment that's non-threatening, non-challenging, and it allows them to basically give you as much information as you want about that. So here's a very simple question that you might ask them. Do you use Sass, less, or Stylus, or none, and why? And it allows you to give an idea of why if they use one of them, why they prefer to use it instead of doing everything in straight CSS. What benefits that it gives you? What are the pros and cons of using that? This allows them to be open. It allows them to give you a very depth understanding on that particular topic, and it has it available to you. And you can basically just let them talk for as long as they want, as long as they don't, speak for the whole 30 minutes, because the casual conversation piece is the last 30 minutes of your hour-and-a-half interview. So you're allowing them to go through this. And when you look at what you need for your company, every position is different. So this is what you're going to be using this casual conversation part about to determine how are you is this person going to fit into your company. So for example, if you're on a small team that moves very quickly, you need to have somebody on your team that's very opinionated, has an idea of what to do, and is willing to go out and make it work. If you're working on a very big project, you just need somebody that's just going to sit there and plug away and do everything, because what you're using How are you going to be doing it? That's been decided. You just need somebody to take the story and convert it into code. So basically how they answer that question will determine which position they might be more suited for. If they're very opinionated when they give you this answer, why I like SAS and I don't like less, and what benefits that it gives me as a programmer, how much time it might save you in your development process, that gives you an idea of where they are and what type of position they should be placed into. Another question would be, what are some online resources that you use? And if they don't say Google, maybe you should not consider hiring them, but basically it tells you what do they use, what are they familiar with, what areas do they reach out to in order to get answers to questions, and that gives you a good information about what they do. Another questions are, what are the various techniques for clearing floats? You're using this in your programming. What do you do to get rid of the impact of floating something on your screen? So they can talk about, because there's multiple ways that you can do it, and the idea is, are they able to provide both of those informations for you? And then the last one, what are some accessibility concerns when you're writing CSS? And I'm just using HTML and CSS. You can replace this with whatever tech stack that you're using within your environment. And some people, might be great programmers, but they don't know what to do about accessibility. If you're writing an application that is a mission critical service that you have in your application, you might need to have somebody that's aware of that, because they need to be able to take advantage of that as they're writing their code. So in a very simple thing, these are very simple questions. They're not threatening questions. You can get if you have 6 people that you're interviewing, you can get 6 completely different answers to these questions. But it will tell you something about the person's character. It will tell you something about what their person's interests are. It will tell you about their motivations and how they go through and actually answer each one of those questions for you. So here's another one. What's your favorite IDE and why? How many of you use an IDE and do in your development? How many of you use Visual Studio Code? Okay, how many of you use IntelliJ or WebStorm or one of their variation products? How many of you use Sublime Text, Vim, brackets? Everybody uses something different. Why is that? Why do you use one over the other one? And let them explain to you. And if the answer would be, I don't know, because my manager told me I had to use it at work, yeah, that's an answer. If you're on a small team that moves fast and you need people that are going to step up and take the plate, would this person fit in on that? There's somebody that's just going to sit down and wait on somebody to make a decision and they just use it, whether they like it or not. Well, you can figure out what type of person that is by just answering the simple questions. Another one, what's your favorite programming language? Why? What do you like? What do you not like? Even if they have opinions on programming languages that they don't use on a day-to-day basis, is a good answer, because they can tell you the difference between them. One's functional, one's object-oriented, whatever else, something like that. Another question would be, if you're writing a simple palindrome function, what type of test would you write? And what would you be testing on if you were writing tests for that? You're not asking them to actually write the function. You're not asking them to write the test. You're just asking them to say what you would do if you were creating the test. Now you're going to be able to see how they think, what they look at in terms of edge cases and whether or not they work. So you can go through and do that. So they can talk about tests and everything else like that. And then you might be able to ask them, like POP, P-O-P, is a palindrome. But what if somebody spells it with a capital P, lowercase o-p? Would that be considered a palindrome? And did they account for that in the test they wrote? Another one that is interesting is Madam, comma, I'm Adam. technically that is a palindrome if you think about it going back and forth. But you've got to strip out the apostrophe, you've got to strip out the comma, you've got to strip out the space. And when you look at it from that standpoint, and the capital M in Madam, because it's the first part of the sentence, is that a palindrome? And did they create a test that covers that? So when you ask something along that lines, you should be able to do that. And then also as a trivia one, if they ever tell you what's the longest palindrome that was ever written, who created it, be impressed, because it was Napoleon, and his was able was I, ere I saw elbow. It's a trivia point for you. So in my conclusion, going through the process of interviewing people, by doing a different method of interviewing candidates in 90 minutes, you can get a better understanding of a person, a potential candidate's technical knowledge, not in one, not in two, not in three, but in 4 different technical areas. And you spent 1 hour to cover those 4 areas. And then for the last 30 minutes or longer, if, or less, if you go over in those four areas, is you've got a good idea of how that person thinks, how they present, are they opinionated on a topic, do they have information about what they feel about things and stuff like that. So that gives you the conclusion on there. So when you start looking at that, what is your opinion on that? Do you think that that might be a little bit better way? I mean, you could easily go out and write a jungle thing, and you can use that to judge somebody. You can spend 90 minutes and see how well they know HTML and CSS, JavaScript, jQuery, Node, and then also how they think. Because when you're doing a coding challenge, you're looking at their code. You're not talking to them, you've not done anything. But within that 90 minutes, you're getting a better feel for that candidate than you would ever get in a coding challenge. You also will be able to get an understanding of their technical abilities by asking these short questions and having them fill things out. For example, you might want to, if you were doing like JavaScript questions, a very simple question would be, write me a function that is passed in a string and it returns the count of every character that was used in that string. You're measuring how well they might know using an object and using that as the counter and returning that to you. And so you can actually ask them to write something like that, and you can understand how well they know that. Now, other information that I have available to you. I have a website that I've created out there that's called codeprep.io. It has a whole series of questions that you can ask people on these 4 topic areas, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and jQuery, that you can look at and you can use. It has questions, and it also has a 10-question quiz where the person is, here's a question, here's 4 possible answers. You go through and actually select the information for that. So if you want to use this thing on your next interview for potential candidates, and you're looking for resources, then you can use the information that's there on codeprep.io. I have 2 other websites. The YouTube channel, it's YouTube/C for channel, and of course my name. I have a series of videos that I've put together on how to ace the whiteboard exercise. Since everybody goes through the whiteboard exercising process when they're interviewing as a developer, here are a series of videos that you can go through, and it covers HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and jQuery. And these are actual questions in my career, in my life, that I've been asked during an interview. And I basically, here's the question, and I actually sit there and write the answer out on a whiteboard, and I will basically come through and I will say, okay, here's the first, pass of me answering this question. And then I refactor the question, and I explain why I'm refactoring it and going through that. And then the in5days.tech is my newest website, where it is, if you want to learn about training topics, you just go to the website. Right now I have 2 that I've completed. I've got 2 more that I'm in process, and I should have finished within the next 10 days. Put your email in. You will get an email, and it's about 1,000-word long email on a topic. And it tells you about it, and for the next 4 days after that, 5 days total, you will get another email that will give you general information about that particular topic itself. So, going back to the very beginning of my presentation, I gave you 3 truths in 1 line. So, let's see how well you've done on this. So, how many of you think the first one, I made only 1 B at university and everything else that I made in my college career was an A, is a lie? Okay? I was in the 2nd largest California earthquake. How many people think that was a lie? Okay? I have been to England 24 times. Okay? I have more toy soldiers than Winston Churchill. How many think that's a lie? Okay. That is actually true. And I'm very proud to say that. I have a huge collection of written toy soldiers. And if you ever go to Charvel, his home, he has all of his toy soldiers in a glass case when you go through the tour that you can see. Because when he was prime minister, he used to play with toy soldiers growing up. He and I had the same passion. And when he became prime minister and he was in office, people would come and visit him in office, they would bring that, and that was like one of the things people would give, and he'd have unique soldiers from all over the world. My collection is big. I have over about 50,000 pieces. And as you can see, going to England, yes, I have been to England exactly 24 times. I've been to 82 countries. That is also true. So the one that's not true is the very first one. I had made straight A's except for 1 B. It's actually flipped. I made 1 A in my entire 4-year college degree. Sorry, Mom. But that's it. So here's the last slide, and I'll go ahead and leave this up on the screen if you want to take a picture. Information, if you need to reach out to me, you have it. The only thing is that my GitHub account, I've changed it from Jennifer Bland to Rat Race Brad, so that you can have it. Any questions anybody has for me? Yes, sir.
So here you're talking about this one interview, 90-minute interview. What are the other steps of the process? Because probably HR has talked to this person, and then maybe some phone screening, and then this, or what do you recommend there?
What we do is we run a job. You get a slew of resumes that come in. We also let people know in the company that we have an opening because they can make referrals. If somebody that works there makes a referral, usually that person goes to the top of the staff. It's just the way things are. What we do is we have an HR person that will reach out, a little bit technical, but we'll ask some basic information, details about them, what they're looking for, what they're expecting in the company, the usual, how soon can you start, what price range are you looking for on a salary and stuff like that. Then normally what we will end up doing is we take the ones that are the best, and then we usually will spend 1 day and we just bring them in back to back to back to back and interview them. And that way, in an hour and a half, usually we can knock out 5 or 6 people in 1 day and get that information from them. With the scoring system that we have, of those 6, you can probably knock out 3 that you're not interested in. You'll have maybe 2 that will be your strongest candidates, and a 3rd one that's kind of close, but maybe not on the same level with the first 2. At that point, then what we would normally do is bring them back and have them in-house do very simple coding exercises, which would be like the simple programming things, like write a palindrome function, but it would be where here are 12 exercises, you might give them an hour to do it. There's no way that they can complete all 12. You know, some people complete 3, some people complete 6. You know, very rarely do we get, 9. You know, I think maybe would be the most, but it's going to be something that's challenged. But it also allows you to get an idea about them because you know which ones of the 12 they pick. And the ones that they pick is because that's where their strengths are, or where their perceived strengths are. So you can use that. And we use that as the second level of interviewing with people from that point. And at that point, we pretty much have a very good understanding of the candidates, and then we can make a decision. So it goes very quickly. Some companies I've seen where it takes months to interview candidates. You know, we can usually turn ours around and have an offer to a candidate from, if they put in a resume on Monday, and if, we can interview them on Wednesday, maybe come back on Friday, we can have an offer ready for the following Monday. Our process is very quick, extremely quick. Yes, ma'am.
Can you speak to, getting the team to work together who's interviewing? It's like sometimes on the 5th interview, you kind of figure out the questions that Sally asked and the questions that John asked. And kind of related to that, have you ever had an experience where you asked teams to essentially take their own team members and put them through interviews and say, would you hire me? The questions that you're asking.
That's a very good question on the second part of your thing. We have not. And the answer to your first one, but I might consider that when we bring that back into the office on Monday, is the first part of your question is we have consistency in the questions that we ask. So therefore, when we're comparing two candidates, we're comparing their answers to this other candidate's answers on that, not that, you ask different questions. So it's going to be very consistent, in what we are doing. So we do that because of the scoring mechanism. We're comparing apples to apples in our interview process, and we can figure out who knows more or less than other candidates when we're talking to. Okay, yes, sir.
Isn't it advisable to have a candidate come in and pair with some of your programmers and actually sit with them for more than an hour and a half?
It is possible. It's not a process that we've used. I have seen companies that do that. I have never, in my career in interviewing, I've never actually been on an interview where you go in and actually pair program with somebody and they can watch and see what you've done. I've just done the traditional whiteboard exercise and that's it. But I think that's a good idea because I have a friend that I have been tutoring that just graduated from a coding boot camp and just started, as a junior developer. I think Monday of last week was her first day. And she interviewed with a company that flew her out to California for 2 days. And she did do that process where they, pair programmed with her, and she sat and talked with, multiple members of the team over that 2-day period. Unfortunately, my experience, I've never gone through that environment. Yes, ma'am.
Your process sounds like it relies on people submitting their resumes within a short period of time and all being able to come in on the same day. How do you make that happen?
Well, normally what we do is we advertise our job positions for a short amount of time, like 2 weeks tops. We get all the information in, and then we start scheduling them within about a week time frame. So anytime during that week, we'll have people coming in. Normally when we get to the second level, we try to schedule them all in the same day or the next day, and that's where we work it out. Yes, sir.
We've had instances where we do that 90-minute process where we ask technical questions. People usually really good at that, and then we go to a program exercise and they just talk about they just don't have the right code, they have the technical skill and knowledge, not the right code. How do you sort of mitigate that?
Well, part of those questions, and unfortunately the examples that I used were HTML and CSS, so you're not writing. If I had used JavaScript questions, you would see where you would have more coding that you're having them do in that 15-minute block. So you can actually have them write, things that, like for example, how do you count the frequency of each letter in a string, write a function for that. Well, that's measuring how well they understand objects and how to use them. Then you can write another function that shows how well they might be using arrays or something along that line. But it also shows you how well they think about how to solve that problem that's on there. So you're giving them something to do. For example, one of the JavaScript questions would be, You know, I'm an old Lotus Notes programmer, so this is what Lotus Notes calls it, and I call it to this day what's called a twisty, which is, you know, the little triangle, you click on it, it expands down and something shows up below that. That's what Lotus Notes calls it, and I don't know what people call it today. I still call it a twisty. Write me some JavaScript code that creates a twisty. You know, some people have no clue how to do that. You know, and you can see how well to do it. It's something that you can literally write in 6 lines of code to be able to provide that function. Maybe not including the image or something. Maybe just have a click a button. When you click on the button, something shows below it. You're not doing a triangle that's expanding down or something.
We did one where we bootstrapped like an application for them, and we said, okay, now we want you to write a image rotator.
That it would be the exact same thing. So you're going through and asking them to do little snippets. So you're seeing where they're strong on each area. And we try to ask questions where we're asking them on, you know, like an object, an array, you know, basic JavaScript questions, you know, like how to access the DOM and get access to things, you know, how to handle a click. You know, if you have 2 buttons on there and you have one function that's going to handle the click for both buttons, but you need to do an alert that says hello world when you click on one button, but, you know, foobar Baz if they click on the other button. How do they know how to do that? So you need to, they'll go through and show you how well they know that in doing something along that line. Because when you think about it, it's just a click function where you're specifying, you know, which the item is in there, and that's still 6 lines of code that's on there, and you can see whether or not they can do something like that. Yes, ma'am.
Follow-up question to that. I think you get far better candidates than we do. I start all phone screens with a 10-minute coding question on Collab Edit where I watch them code, and over half the candidates are done after 10 minutes, so I wouldn't want to spend 90 minutes with them. And I think that's part of how do you make sure they can code. You don't bring them in if they can't code.
That's a good point. Any other questions? Yes, sir. In our company, because I work for the Digital Accelerator for Stanley Black & Decker, what we do are proof of concepts for the company. We do bleeding edge things. Like, it's not unusual that we end up doing things like, how do you control a drone? And we end up having people flying around drones in the office, and you're like, okay, that works. You know, facial recognition, like when you walk up to the door, you've got, you know, a cheap old webcam that you can just buy off of Amazon. Does it recognize you and will unlock the door? We're doing stuff like that, so we're interviewing for people for us. We don't worry about Stanley Black & Decker because technically we get our paycheck from them, but we consider ourselves separate because of what we do. The business units are totally different on what they do. Okay? Okay, that's it. Thank you very much for coming.